Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is sponsored by Birch Living and was supposed to consist of me following an altered version of Nora Waugh's Perriot jacket pattern from the book The Cut of Women's Clothes. I started working on an altered version of this pattern back in October, so I was really excited to finally get started on it. And I was going to make it from a black quilting cotton with a contrasting bright red quilted petticoat. And I attempted to do that, but as you can probably tell by the thumbnail, that's not what I actually ended up making. The final garment is constructed from a bright pink silk taffeta with an ivory quilted petticoat made out of my bedspread. This project was definitely a test of my patience at times, but I do like how it's coming along, and I hope you guys like watching me construct it. So on that note, let's get into the video. I decided to start by making the base for the jacket first, so I'm cutting those pattern pieces out of a lightweight canvas. This will serve as the base that the pleated portion is fitted to and sewn to. After it was cut out, I used a pencil to mark the boning channel placement, and then off camera, I sewed 3/8 of an inch wide twill tape alongside these markings to create channels for the bones. So I got the canvas lining it seamed together, and then I sewed down the seam allowance to create boning channels there. I sewed down the twill tape to create boning channels there. So now these are ready for boning, and my boning roll is looking nice and full. So I ironed the bottom edge of this piece inward, which serves as a stopper, so I can just go ahead and add the bones. With the base layer done, I could move on to cutting out the jacket. Now I have the pattern pinned onto my fabric, and this pattern is just for the top, so it was originally a jacket. So I'm actually going to extend this by 40 inches at the hem, so I'm just going to use a ruler to measure away from the bottom edge of the pattern. I have realized that this fabric isn't quite wide enough for what I had in mind, so I'm probably going to have to sew on an extension, which is a bit annoying, but hopefully there's going to be enough material there that I can just sew that onto the straight edge of the fabric and get the width I need. But I'm going to cut out what I can right now, and then I'll sew on the extension afterwards and trim it. And then I had to figure out how to mark the pleats onto the jacket, which was a difficult task since this material is dark and printed, which means even though it's lightweight, I can't really trace through it to bring these markings to the right side of the fabric, which is where they need to be. I was also worried the lightweight cotton wouldn't hold the pleats very well, so I decided I was going to use fusible interfacing to resolve both of these problems. I'm draping the lightweight interfacing over top my pattern and tracing all of the pleat markings onto it. Then I very carefully fused the interfacing onto the wrong side of the top of the jacket panels. Once that was done, I lifted the bottom edge of the interfacing and cut it into a zigzag shape, so there wouldn't be a defined line where the drape of the cotton changes where the interfacing is sewn on. Then I went through with my favorite waxed thread, which I like to use for basting since it slides through the material really easily, and I basted across all of these Sharpie lines on the interfacing to bring it to the right side of the fabric. Once everything was brought to the right side of the fabric, I could begin pleating it, and this is pleated from the back towards the front. And basically I just have 15 minutes of failed attempts of doing this. So I started by pinning the back edge of the jacket panel to the lining and pleating from that point outward, but then there was no room for the underside of the pleats to go, so then I pinned the front edges together and pinned from that point backwards, and this also didn't work, and I got very frustrated and decided I need to clear my head and sleep on it. So I slept on it, and this morning I ended up figuring out how to handle this. So what I did is I pleated down the panels completely, and then after the pleats were pinned in place, I stretched the material to fit over top of the lining, and then I actually sewed the pleats down and sewed through the lining at the same time. And this worked much better than trying to pleat it atop the lining. And I still get what I wanted, where the pleats are secured to the lining layer, so it should all sit really smoothly when it's worn. So that's how I would recommend doing this if you choose to make something like this. However, what I would not recommend is picking a dark colored printed fabric because the pleats are not really visible at all on this. So I actually took another night to sleep on my plans for this project, and I've decided to start over. And while I play some footage of me starting over and repeating all of the steps you just saw but with a different material, I'm going to talk a little bit about my recent sleep experiences because today's sponsor is Birch Living. Birch Living is a premium mattress in a box company that makes mattresses and sleep products that are comfortable and environmentally conscious. Their organic, non-toxic mattresses are made right here in America, and I'm happy to now be the owner of their new Birch Luxe Natural Mattress, an upgraded version of their already well-loved Birch mattress. It's crafted with responsibly sourced and sustainably produced materials, including organic cashmere, New Zealand wool, fair trade cotton, and 100% natural latex. With 8 different layers, the Luxe was specifically created with breathability and support in mind, both of which appealed greatly to me. As I said last time I worked with Birch Living, I am an unfortunately and unpleasantly sweaty sleeper. It has made me incredibly conscious of the materials I surround myself in. On a day-to-day basis, I live and sleep in nothing but cotton, and I've never purchased bedding that is made from a fiber other than cotton. So it is bizarre to me that I never considered what my actual mattress is made from and how that might affect me in my sleep. The mattress is comprised of an organic cotton cover, layer, a quilted Euro top, 3 organic comfort layers, a latex pressure relief layer, and a steel coil support layer. Each Birch mattress comes with 2 of their Eco-Rest pillows made from recycled plastic bottles. They're breathable and better for the environment. And the best part of all of this is that Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. It comes rolled up in a box and is super easy to set up yourself. As you can see, Minnie was very interested in this process, and she may have eaten part of the box in addition to helping set it up. I really appreciated the ease of purchasing through their website as opposed to a store, but in case purchasing online makes you nervous, they also offer a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. I've had my Birch mattress for a few months and my super comfy plush topper for a few weeks. So far, I'm really enjoying both of them and having a more natural, organic, and breathable mattress. It's also very supportive, which helps release pressure points, and is overall just a huge upgrade from what I was sleeping on before. If you've been dreaming about a new mattress, don't wait any longer. Until January 31st, all Birch financing offers are 0% APR. Head to birchliving.com to see if your purchase qualifies for this limited time offer. I love my Birch mattress and think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch. You can click the link below or go to birchliving.com/Clayton for $400 off your mattress plus 2 free pillows. Thank you to Birch for sponsoring this video, and let's get on to the second attempt at this project. So you should have seen me cut out the front jacket panels from the silk, transfer all of the markings onto interfacing once again, then use basting stitches to bring those markings to the right side of the fabric, and then crease the fabric at those basting stitches, bring them to the next line of basting stitches, and pin them down. The lining was then stretched to fit over the base layer, which is what I figured out worked best on my first failed attempt. And now we are all caught up and I can start narrating it in real time. So now I'm basically back to where I was a couple days ago. This is the lining I just removed the pleated cotton from. Here we have the corresponding pleated panel, which is made from the silk that will go atop it. And I do also have one of these panels which has been sewn together so I can prove that this actually works, and I'm happy enough with the result to carry on. To get the pleats to be a bit more prominent on this one, I've spaced them further away from the fold, and I've also made the stitches slightly larger. This had the effect of causing the material to look a little bit wrinkled, but hopefully that will press out and I'll still be able to maintain the shadows between the pieces that show off those beautiful lines. You'll also notice that the back couple of pleats are just pinned. They haven't been sewn yet, and that's because I'm going to have to sew the back panel onto this, and that's going to be much easier if I could lift the fabric as opposed to having it tacked to the lining. But the rest have been sewn, and now I'm going to repeat this process on the other panel. So there is some variation in the pleats despite my best efforts, so this probably won't line up absolutely perfectly, but I'm going to get it to be the best I possibly can. So it doesn't line up perfectly, as you can see here and here and here, but it is going to be good enough, and now I can start sewing down the pleats. And to sew these pleats down, I'm going to be using a matching thread, or the best match that I have. My pink thread collection is a bit lacking for how much I love the color. So where the basting stitches start at the bottom, I'm going to bring the thread up through all the layers of fabric and then just create one knot, again through all the layers of fabric. So even if the knot at the end of the thread comes undone, it's going to be firmly mounted. I'm going to go underneath the pleat and come up about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge. And then I'm just going to continue stitching about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the pleat. And I'm keeping my stitches a little bit bigger and further apart than what would probably be ideal, because I found this made them a little bit more visible. And I do want the pleats to be visible. That's like the interesting part of this garment. And when I can, my stitches are going through all the layers of fabric, including the base layer, but where there's boning or the fabric is too thick, it's sort of difficult to do that, so I'm not being particularly fussed. I figure as long as some of the stitches go through the base layer, they'll be firmly mounted together. So I'm just going to carry on doing this for all but the backmost pleats, holding off on doing that until after I have it seamed to the back panel. And I'm really procrastinating cutting out the back panel because I feel like I've already wasted so much fabric on this project. I'm still not extraordinarily pleased with how it's coming out. I don't want to waste more to cut out the back panels, but I am pretty invested at this point, and I think I'm going to persevere and try and get it finished, even if I'm not thrilled with how it's looking right now. I think that means I have to do it. But if I end up abandoning this project after doing that, I'm going to feel really bad at all of the fabric waste. And once I reach the end, I'm just going to tie the thread off and then move on to the next pleat. So the back panel is now pinned on, and I've marked out the skirt portion and it's ready to be cut out. I did end up having to cut some of the volume from the skirt. So initially the skirt was supposed to follow this line, but then I would have had to piece the skirt and add a really large section here, and I don't actually have a ton of fabric left. So I decided just to make it slightly less full and follow this line, and then it fits on the width of the material without having to piece it. And I repeat the same thing over there. And it's still gonna have tons of volume. I don't think this is going to affect its appearance too much. And speaking of tons of volume, this has taken tons of fabric. I had 8 yards of this material, and after this piece is cut out, I'm going to have 0 uninterrupted yardage. Luckily, I do have large pieces on the sides, which will hopefully be enough for the skirt detailing I want to do, as well as these sleeves. So now I'll get this cut out and then figure out what the next construction assembly step is going to be. So these are the side panels that have been pleated and prepped, and these are the back panels which have been cut out, and then I've just fused interfacing onto the back so it'll have the same drape as the upper portion of this material, which has also been interfaced. So now I'm going to remove these pins and I'm going to seam the side back seams together, and hopefully then everything will lay flat over the lining, and then I can do up the center back seam. So I was just pinning this, and then I remembered that I didn't actually want to sew this as a seam. I want to pleat these side seams of the back panel over the side panel to make it look cohesive with the rest of the pleats. So I'm actually going to start the seam where the pleat marking ends. So it'll be sewn from here to the hem, and then this upper portion will all be hand sewn. I sewed the side back seam with a 3/4 inch allowance, and then I just trimmed the majority of the allowance off using pinking shears, and that's all the finishing I'm going to do there. Now the upper portion of this seam was left open because I'm going to lap this edge over the side panel and stitch it down so it mimics the other pleated details. To accomplish this, I just backstitched at this point where the pleats end and didn't sew above that. However, I did turn the seam allowance of the back panel inward by 3/4 of an inch and just pressed it. And now that's going to lap over the side panel by 3/4 of an inch and get stitched down. But first I'm going to replate the back portion and fit it to the lining, which I unpleated so it'd be easier to sew the bottom portion of the seam. So I didn't film any of that because I honestly didn't have a lot of confidence that it would work, but I sewed down the next 2 pleats. Then I sewed together the back seam of the lining. Then I sewed together the back seam of the back panel up to the point where the pleats begin. Now I have this awkward bunching where the overlay is wider than the lining. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to look and how I'm going to manage that, which is why I didn't fully do up this seam. I'm going to pin one of the back panels over the other and try and get rid of some of that excess volume and make this look okay. And I'm going to try and do that while it's on my dress form, because then I'll be able to get a better idea of what it will look like finished. So I think I sort of got it figured out. It still doesn't look great, but it's definitely sitting much closer to the lining than it was before. I did have a little oopsie up here where the back panels weren't wide enough to fully cover the lining, so I'm going to have to do some sort of piecing there or trim because there's barely any overlap here, and I think there's ultimately going to be a frayed edge there. I'm also not thrilled with how puckery this looks, but it is what it is. Okay, please just try to ignore the puckers, but I ended up getting that back seam sewn and also the side seams of the back over top of the side panels. And now I'm getting some ugly looking creasing down here, more so than usual at least. So I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to undo this stitching and fold this pleat further over this pleat, and then that should get rid of that little creasing right there. And it's less severe, but still present on this side, so I think I can do it on that side as well. And then hopefully it will look a little bit better, and then I can get it pressed and get psyched up for fitting. But first I'm going to try and fix this. I don't know if this is going to look any better to you. It is still a puckered mess, but as I said, that's going to get ironed out later. But I just undid the stitching here and then pulled this pleat to sit over top of the pleat next to it, and now everything looks a little bit less puckery. So unfortunately this means that I have to completely re-sew this edge down because there's no tie-off point between here and the top. So I have to completely re-sew that to make sure it doesn't come undone in the future. But then I can move on to another element of this project. My backdrop continues to be a mess, but I just quickly draped the skirt. It's going to have lots of volume in the back, and it's going to puff out more in the back because I'm going to cartridge pleat the waistline, and it's going to be made from a pretty thick material. So now I have to get my quilt out and see if it's wide enough for me to accomplish this, because in the past I've used king-sized quilts, whereas this is a queen-sized quilt. So I got the underskirt cut out. My quilt wasn't quite wide enough for me to cut it to the full width I wanted, but I do have this large offcut, so I think I can piece at the back. You won't see the seams. It'll be hidden by the skirt of the jacket. So right here I have the offcut quilt of the underskirt that's left over, and I think I'm going to piece some of the larger portions of this left over together to create an additional panel for the back, but that will be hidden by the overskirt, so it doesn't have to be pretty. So I'm going to be a little bit fussy in terms of positioning the bodice piece that I cut out, which will make up the front of the bodice. So I've got these vertical stripes. I don't know if they're going to show up on the camera, and I've got this sort of scallopy design. So I think it'd be really nice if this stripe was at the center front of the bodice. So I'm going to position this piece right where I want it to be. As you can tell by when I said cut freely, I mean I'm not paying attention to how close it is to the edges because I am fussy cutting it out because I like the pattern at this point. So once that's how I want it, I'm just going to trace around it. And I was going to use a pencil for this, but it was dragging, so I'm going to use a Sharpie and just deal with your guys' wrath. I know you really hate it when you use Sharpies on fabric, which is fair. Sorry, the heat just went on, so you can probably hear that in the background, but now I'm going to cut this out, and I'm only going to cut out one layer. The heat is still on, so I'm just going to talk louder, but now I'm going to use the layer I just cut out as a guide for making sure the pattern is symmetrical on what will be the other side of the bodice. So I'm just going to make sure that the quilted stripes on this line up with the quilted stripes on the uncut layer of material. I'm going to make sure the scallop placement is the same. So basically I want the pattern on this piece to perfectly blend in with the pattern on the piece that I haven't cut out yet. And that ensures that once I do cut it out, it will be symmetrical. So as you can see, these stripes line up there and there and there and there. This band lines up, this band lines up, as best I can at least. This doesn't line up perfectly due to variations in the pattern. This stripe lines up, this scallop lines up, etc. So now I'm going to weight down this piece and then trace around it and then get that cut out as well. So I just cut out the lining, and I cut it out of muslin and old mock-up scraps. So if the starting fabric was odd in terms of dimensions, that's why, but I did make sure that everything was cut relatively straight on the grain line so it didn't work, even though the lining doesn't have a ton of structural integrity, especially the back and side back pieces, which are just lining the jacket and covering up all of the stitching and raw edges. This front piece, however, is going to line the quilted layer, and I was originally going to cut this piece out of a lightweight canvas inner lining to give it more structural integrity, but the quilted fabric is pretty sturdy, so I don't actually think that's going to be an issue. So I just cut it out of muslin, and now I'm going to go ahead and sew some twill tape boning channels over top of the boning points that I've marked. There's one here, one here, one here, and one here. And I've done that on the back as well. I've also marked where the tabs are going to be cut to, and I've marked where the jacket should overlap onto these panels. I got all of the boning channels sewn, and then while I was at it, I also sewed together the side and back panels. And then off camera, I quickly basted around the bottom and front and side edges of the front panels. So I didn't want to baste across the top edge because then I'd be sewing the boning channels closed, which would make them ineffective. But I did stitch around the side, I stitched around the front, and then most importantly I stitched around the bottom, and I also stitched up and around where the tabs are going to be. So I'm going to be cutting the fabric or slashing the material on this line, and I want to make sure that the two layers stay together at that point. So that should accomplish that. Now the next step is just going to be seaming the side back and back panels onto the front panels, and then I can go ahead and slash the tabs and start getting those bound. And to do that I'm going to have to cut out some binding, so I think I'm going to do that really quick. I did not end up filming that, but the strips that I'm using to bind the bottom edge are just 2-inch wide bias cut strips with one edge turned inward by 1/2 inch. The other raw edge is sewn on around the bottom edge and the tabs using a 1/3 of an inch seam allowance. Tabs are always a pain in the butt to bind, but I find it's easiest to do it without any pins because then you can stretch the bias binding as you go and get what I think is a cleaner finish. I've gone through this process in more detail in previous videos, so I won't bore you too much with it in this one. So I just finished sewing the binding on, and this is what it looks like right after it's been sewn. This is what it looks like after I've folded it over the raw edge and gotten it pinned from the front. And I'm pinning from the front so I can make sure that it looks like an even width from the right side of the fabric, and then I'll sew down the other edge from the wrong side of the fabric, so it's stitched to the lining and there aren't any visible stitches from the right side of the material. Alright, so the binding is now done. I didn't end up filming that, but you've seen me do it recently. So I just whip stitched the edge to the lining, at least on the quilted panels. Then on the back panel, I just stitched it by machine. I also transferred the line where the jacket will be sewn to this bodice lining and front section onto the front of the quilted panels using basting stitches. So now I just have to line up the jacket with those edges and sew it on, theoretically, but I'm not entirely sure if everything's going to line up. It sort of depends how good of a job I did when making the pattern. And before getting those sewn together, I decided I would press all the pleats. So I just started, but this side is mostly pressed, and you can see how many of the wrinkles I managed to get out compared to this side. It does mean that the pleats are a little bit less visible, but from an angle you can still see them. But you can also see how puckered that side is by comparison. So hopefully I can get these both smoothed out a fair bit, and then I guess I will turn the front edge inward by 3/4 of an inch, and I will see how well this lines up with the lining. I don't know when I last updated you, but I actually got the jacket to fit over top of the lining pretty nicely. So I'm relatively pleased with how it looks, but since it's so far at the sides, the front is basically all white, and though I was planning on doing this bow detail on the underskirt, I feel like even the front of the bodice, the quilted portion, looks pretty plain now. I was originally going to decorate it with some dotted details because I have a fabric paint in the same color as the silk, but I really hate how they look. So I think instead I'm going to do some sort of puffed ruffle around the neckline. And then the bottom edge of the underskirt has these stripes. And I think I might sew some pink silk between the borders of the stripes, so there's that detail going on. Maybe I will incorporate a ruffle into the bottom edge of the skirt too, so it's cohesive with the bodice. But definitely need something, because right now it's just a lot of ivory quilted fabric and I don't love how that looks. From the side though, I think it's going to be pretty cute and dramatic with the skirt and the pleats and whatnot. I just have to get the underskirt to look more cohesive with this jacket that I have created. Okay, so I have 2 of the bands on the bottom and I really like how they look, but I still think this skirt needs something more. So I'm going to carry on with the bow detail I was planning initially. Now I started trying to draw it directly onto the fabric, but that was sort of tricky to do. So I ended up just using muslin to block out the shape I want. And now I'm going to trace around this onto the material. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to cut out this exact shape from the silk taffeta plus seam allowance, or if I'm just going to try and do it with bias cut strips. So that is to be determined, but so far I'm liking how it looks. And I think it's going to be a cute little detail. I'm going to have the tails continue all the way around the skirt, or at least that's my current plan. I was not in a talkative mood this day, so past me filmed the process and current me is going to narrate it. To do the 3/4 inch wide strips near the hem of the skirt, I'm first cutting out 2 inch wide strips on the material's bias. And the bottom edge was about 100 inches wide, so I needed about 100 inches of bias cut strips. I sewed the strips together until I had one long continuous strip, and then at my ironing board I folded and pressed one long edge inward by about 1/2 inch. I did this from one end to another, and then it was back to the sewing table, where I pinned that folded edge to align with the line of stitching it was going to be sewn between. This edge was sewn down by hand using running stitches, not particularly short or close together running stitches, since this is just trim as opposed to a structural element of the garment, so it doesn't need to be super securely secured. After the top edge was sewn on, I folded the bottom edge inward so it aligned with the other line of stitching. Then I just pinned it down and repeated the process of using running stitches to secure it. The same exact method was used for the bow detail on the skirt, though that looks a little bit more elaborate. So I still have to press it, but this is what the bow looks like. You can see some of the water-soluble marking pen from when I was doing the outline. I just followed the outer curves with the bias cut strips and then sewed down the outer curve and then turned the bottom edge inward to get the shapes that I wanted. The points at the bottom were very annoying to do. I actually pressed those before pinning it on so I could get them relatively sharp, and I used little tiny slip stitches around the points as opposed to running stitches to make sure they would look nice and sharp. The center of the bow is pleated to give it a little bit of volume, and then I ended up adding this little inner piece because it sort of looked like sunglasses before I added that, and I felt like that helped make it look more like a bow. I don't know if I absolutely adore it, but I do think it was a nice addition to the skirt and a good way to jazz it up. With that all finished, I could cut out the rest of the trims for the skirt, which included binding for the hem, which will be made of 3.5 inch wide strip, and I needed a 100 inch length of these as well. There's also going to be some gathered trim on the skirt, and I'm going to use this for the bodice as well. I needed about 120 inches of the finished trim, but it will be gathered down, so I need to cut strips that were almost twice that length. And these were also 3.5 inches wide. After all of those were cut out, they were seamed together, so I had a 100 inch long strip for the hem and a 240 inch long strip for the ruffle. The strip for the hem had one edge turned inward and pressed by about 1/2 inch. Then it was set aside. The strip for the ruffled trim, however, had both edges turned inward by approximately 1/2 inch. The soon-to-be ruffled strip was then taken over to my sewing machine. I unfolded the folded edges and stitched along the crease point. And as I'm stitching, I am pushing fabric underneath the presser foot, so it is gathered down to approximately half its original length. This was repeated on both sides. And then it was taken back to my ironing board where I tried to turn the edges inward where they were previously creased, which is also where the stitch point was. And I thought I would naturally want to turn inward at this point because that's how it worked on my sample. But as you can see, I am struggling here. On my sample, the edges really want to turn inward at that stitch point, and I could press it really flat and nice. But for some reason, on the trim I ended up making, that isn't the case. It sort of wants to fold inward below the stitching, and then you get an uneven edge at the top as opposed to an even edge like you see here. So I think I'm actually just going to fold this inward by hand as I go, and then I can get it more precise than I could just ironing. Like, see, that's relatively straight and relatively precise as opposed to how it naturally wants to turn inward at the ironing table. I think the reason this happened is because the gathering isn't even on both edges since I just did it by eye, or maybe it's just gathered more than my sample, so that's why it's doing that. I'm not entirely sure, but the fact of the matter is that I'm going to have to approach applying this to the project a little bit differently than I did with my sample. It should still work out, or at least I hope it will. Though it wasn't what I originally intended on doing, this method worked really well. It was pretty easy by hand to turn the edges inward at the stitch point. I'm just doing that, and I am pinning it to be an even width away from the top and bottom bands, and there ended up being about a 1/4 inch of visible quilted material beneath it on either side. The edges of the ruffle were sewn down in the same way as all of the other trim on the skirt. I just used small running stitches and evened it out even further as I was sewing it on. With that done, it was time for binding. I just aligned the bottom edge of that strip that has one edge turned inward with the bottom edge of the skirt and seamed it on with a 3/4 inch allowance. So 2 things of note, I did not have a full bobbin in when I tried to sew that binding on, so it didn't actually get sewn on. So I have to re-sew it anyways, and I was just looking from the underside, and it looks like I was actually about a 1/4 inch off. So I don't know if I just measured wrong or what, but I think this time I'm going to sew from the underside so I can see the line of quilting stitches that I'm trying to align it with, and I can sew right across that line of stitches to make sure that it perfectly matches up there. So that is not perfect, but it's much better. Here you can see sort of the shadow of the stitches from the first attempt, and as you can see they're about a 1/4 inch below that line of quilting detail that I was trying to get it paired up with. So this should look much better. I did however have to use contrasting bobbin thread because I was too lazy to make a new bobbin. So now I'm just going to wrap this over the hem, the raw edge, and then pin it to the underside, and that will be whip stitched down. I got everything pinned, so now I'm just going through and sewing the inner edge of the binding to the interior of the skirt. And I was originally going to do this with whip stitches, but I feel like running stitches are like the stitch of this project, so I'm using those instead. And after this is done, I think I'm going to do up the back seam and try and get the top gathered down. I was originally going to focus more on the bodice today and do a fitting with that, and then try and get the sleeves figured out. But the back of the jacket actually goes relatively low down, and the slope it takes over the skirt is going to affect the fit. So the volume the skirt has is going to affect the fit of the jacket and thus the bodice. So I think it's actually better to get the skirt finished and then I can try that on with the bodice. That means I have to figure out how to gather down the top edge. I was originally going to do cartridge pleats, but I'm worried this fabric is almost too thick for cartridge pleats. And unfortunately, I chipped a nail while doing the pinning, but I don't have time to fix it, so we're just gonna have to suffer with that today. That truly shows how rushed I am if I'm not taking time to fix a nail. Alright, so I still have to press it, but that is what it looks like from the exterior. All nice and relatively even compared to the other banded details. So I'm very pleased with that. Actually, before I get to sorting out the top edge, I just want to show you how all the trim looks. So despite the little issue I was having with my ruffled trim not looking quite like the sample, I still think it turned out pretty well. So very happy with this so far, and now it's time to sort of get the shape figured out and get the top edge gathered down. Actually, before that, there's one more thing I want to mention. So I originally told you that the quilt wasn't wide enough to fully cut out the skirt pattern like I intended. So I was planning on piecing a back section that wouldn't be trimmed because it would be hidden by the back of the jacket. And I was going to wait until the bodice was cut out and everything so I knew how much fabric I had left to play with to create those back panels. So I ended up having enough width that I could pretty much cut the panel to be the length of the skirt. It was actually about an inch short, so I just decided that I wasn't going to hem it. I was going to have the back panel be slightly shorter than the rest of the skirt, and since it'll be hidden, it won't really matter. So instead of being finished with binding like the front of the panel, the back just has its scalloped finishing from being a quilt. So when it comes to gathering, I was originally going to cartridge pleat, and to do that, the top edge is stitched directly onto the waistband without seam allowance, which means you have to finish the top edge before pleating it. So typically you would turn it inward by whatever amount, and then you would pleat it down. But if I do that, see how thick these pleats are turning out? Like, those are super duper chunky. I think they're chunkier than I want them to be. And I think it's going to create a really sort of awkward shape at the waistline if I move forward with that. So what I'm thinking of doing is trimming 1.5 inches or 1 3/4 rather off the top edge, and then sewing on a strip of cotton. And then it will be the cotton that is turned inward. It'll be one layer of the quilted fabric and one layer of cotton, and the pleats will be much finer. They'll look more like this, they'll be much smaller, and they'll create a much nicer drape at the waistline. So that is my current plan. So I'm just going to hold this up to me to check the length and make sure that'll be okay cutting that amount off the top edge, and then we can carry on with finishing this edge and getting it pleated down. So I just held it up to my waist, and I was originally going to turn this edge inward by 2 inches, but now I'm going to be seaming something onto it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which means I can cut this top edge down by 1 3/4 inches. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Just going to mark that out as best I can. And this top edge is curved and the bottom edge is completely straight, as was common with 18th century skirts. They were raised from the waistline as opposed to being cut at the hem. And I'm also going to make sure to transfer the placement of my notches because these indicate how much or where the gathering on the skirt is. So it's important that they end up being visible. So now I'm just going to cut along this line and notch at the various points where it's necessary. Then with the right sides facing each other, I will be seaming on a bias cut strip. This is actually a notion that I purchased from Bias Bespoke, and it is a relatively crisp material, cotton material, that has been cut on the bias and turned into 2-inch wide strips. So I could make my own bias strips and seam those on, but I think I'm just going to use this instead since I have it. So I will align this with the top edge of the quilted material, and with the right sides facing each other, I will sew it on with a 1/4 inch allowance. So I got the bias strip sewn onto the top edge, and then I went over to the ironing board and just pressed it inward. So now I can gather down the top edge. Well, soon I can. First, I should really bind the back edge. I typically do this after the center back seam is done up, but it's going to be much easier to mark the cartridge pleats if I can lay it completely flat. So I'm actually going to bind the top 12 inches of the back edges first, and then I'll just seam it up later and deal with the fact that there's a raw edge at the bottom of the opening. I do have a few little scraps of binding left, which I'm hoping are going to be enough to accomplish this. I am just cutting the seam allowance out from the top 12 inches because the binding doesn't require any seam allowance to sew on. So I gathered down one side of the skirt and I was going to do the other side, but my fingers hurt so much. They're very tender and I was worried about getting blood on the skirt. So I'm taking a break and working on the waistband. So what I've done is I've just cut a piece of muslin on the straight grain, and then I've marked a line straight on the grain and a line 1 inch away from that. And between those two lines, I'm going to fuse on some band roll, which is a buckram-like material with fusible web on one side, and it is used to prevent waistbands from rolling and to make them a little bit more structurally solid. And we want a really solid waistband for this because the cartridge pleats are going to be mounted to it. We have to finish all the edges of the waistband because it's going to be sewn onto a finished edge of the skirt. Now I'm just going to cut my material down. So there's about 3/4 of an inch of margin around each edge. The ends over the end of the band roll. And the band roll is cut to be the exact dimensions I want the finished waistband to be. It doesn't extend into any of the seam allowances or anything because then they would become very bulky. Now I'm going to turn one of the edges in over the band roll. One of the long edges, I guess. Now I've just trimmed the other edge down. I'm going to fold its raw edge inward by about 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to fold that over the other edge. So now the band roll is completely encased. There is this folded edge right here, which I'm going to stitch down by machine to the band roll so it will not come undone. And I'm going to stitch across the short ends too, but I'm going to clean up the corners off camera, just tuck them inward so there isn't any raw edges escaping. And I might trim down some of the allowance from the interior too so it's not as bulky. But that, for the most part, is going to be our waistband. And once I finish pleating down or gathering down the top edge of the skirt, it can be sewn on. So as I've said numerous times, I was going to cartridge pleat down this top edge, but I have decided that that's not necessary. For cartridge pleats, I'd normally mark everything out super carefully, and I do 2 rows of stitching so they extend further from the garment once they're sewn onto a waistband, and I just don't really feel like that's necessary for this one. So instead by eye, I'm using 1/2 inch running stitches about 1/4 inch away from the top edge of the skirt. I'm stitching from one notch to another, and then I'm going to gather the material down to 6 inches just by pulling on the thread, and then I'm going to tie the thread off, and then for the back portion of the skirt, I'm going to be doing deeper pleats because there's going to be more volume there. So I'm going to be doing 1.5 inch wide stitches. I'm going to be gathering it down to 5 inches. And again, if these were cartridge pleats, I would be measuring everything, and I'm obviously not. All right, so once I reach that notch, which has now been transferred to the bias strip with pencil, I'm just going to pull on the thread until it is gathered down to the length I want. And I actually said 6 inches because that's what I initially marked on the pattern, but I measured it out and then the waistband would end up being too big. So I'm going to gather both portions down to 5 inches, but one is going to have the deeper pleats because there's a lot more volume to gather down to this amount. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I can adjust them more once I sew it onto the waistband. And when I'm doing this, I'm using heavy duty upholstery thread because I'm putting a lot of strain on the thread and I don't want it to break. Normal thread will break. And then you have to start over again, and it really sucks. And I'm speaking from experience, unfortunately. So now I have like twice the amount of volume to gather down to the same length as the portion I just did. So that's why I'm going to use 1.5 inch wide stitches. Then the pleats will be deeper. And again, I'm just doing this by eye. Am I going to regret that? Perhaps, but I really do think it'll be fine. I'm not trying to be lazy with this, I'm just trying to expend the exact amount of effort that is necessary to get a good end result. Or at least that's what I'm telling myself. So I don't feel bad about being lazy. Now this is fully stitched, so I'm just going to pull on the end of the thread until it is gathered down to the width I want. That is what the pleats look like, and despite using a cotton lining instead of 2 layers of the quilt, they're still very bulky pleats and they're going to provide a lot of volume. But as you can see, these ones are much less deep, so they won't provide as much volume. Really, the volume is going to be packed at the back of the skirt, which is what we want. My dog was barking, so I did not talk over that part, but I just finished sewing the ungathered portion of the front panel to the waistband. So basically, the way you sew on a cartridge pleated skirt to a waistband is that you're sewing through the finished edges of the waist of the skirt as well as the waistband, and you're going through the edges and whip stitching them together. So then from the exterior it looks like this. Now when you're doing the portions that have been pleated, you're only grabbing onto the top pleats. So you're not sewing on this, that part's going to be left free, you're just sewing on the ones that meet the waistband. And this is a little bit trickier because I didn't gather these down to be small enough, so they don't actually match the width of the waistband, so I'm having to sort of shrink the pleats as I sew them on. It's also sort of a delicate balance of making sure you take enough threads from both materials, because if you take too few, then the threads can just break and the skirt will detach at that point. But if you take too many, then it sort of doesn't look very good. So it takes a bit of practice, and you sort of have to alter your technique depending on how thick your material is and depending what silhouette you're going for. And it's all just quite tedious and annoying, but it does make for a nice end result. And cartridge pleats provide a lot of volume without any bulk in the waistband. So since there's no seam allowance, there's no bulk, and this is also going to sit flat against the body, and then you're going to have all of that volume coming off from it. So it is a very specific effect, and it is worth doing for some things, but it can be a bit of a pain as well. And it's pretty brutal on the fingers, and my fingers are already quite sore. But I'm going to carry on doing this until the entire top edge of the skirt is sewn on, and then I'm going to sew up the back seam, and then I think the skirt will pretty much be done aside from closures. So I'll have to go back to psyching myself up for trying on the bodice and figuring out the sleeves, which are two things I am not looking forward to. I lied. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to end this video right here. I haven't even finished this project and I still have another hour of footage to go through. So I think this is as good of a point to cut it off as any. However, I do have some photos of how it's coming along to include before I go. All I did after I finished filming, before taking these photos, was removing the jacket from the lining and the quilted panel. This made it much easier to attach trim to the top edge of the quilted front panel, which I did, and also much easier to hem the perimeter of the jacket, which I also did. And with that done, this is how it is looking so far, but there's still quite a bit to do. I have to attach these layers together, I have to sort out closures, I have to sew up the back seam of the underskirt, figure out the sleeves, and knowing me, probably make a matching hat to go with it as well. So if that sounds interesting to you, then I hope you will subscribe and stay tuned. Thank you so much to Birch Living for sponsoring this video, and to all of you for watching, and I will talk to all of you very soon.